Hi, I'm Jake. You know, every single Magic the Gathering player started with a box. And if you've been playing for a while, your box might look something like this. This was mine, 75 random cards. It was a tournament pack from 1999. But if you started a little more recently, your first box might look like this. This is a pre-release kit. But if you skip the 60 card formats altogether, it probably might look something like this, or this, one of the Commander starter decks. Or if you skipped the pre-constructed stuff altogether and just wanted to get packs, you might have bought a fat pack or a bundle like this. If you have friends that play, chances are they gave you a box that looks like this. I'm not actually sure where you buy these. I think they just show up if you play Magic long enough. But there's another thing that's true about every single Magic player. Eventually, you got enough cards that they didn't all fit in that box. No matter how big your first box of cards was, pretty quickly you needed more. More space, more cards. And then it became hard to keep track of. And that's what I want to talk about today. How do we organize our Magic cards in a way that works for us? Because we're all looking for something a little bit different out of the game. And I think our organizational strategy should reflect that. So pull up a chair, have a seat at the table, and whether you're a button mash hack and slash controller bash, or a meeple moving mastermind of maps, mats, and minis, if you ruffle at the awful riffle shuffle scuffle, or if you're a click clack pick attack number ball luck sack, we're all here for the same reason. I'm Jake. Let's talk games. So before we start talking about boxes or specific strategies for organizing our cards, I think we need to recognize that there's a lot of different types of people that play Magic the Gathering. And depending on what you're trying to get out of the game, your organizational strategy might look very different. I've said this before, but Magic the Gathering isn't a game, right? It's a variety of games that all just happen to use the same game pieces. And depending on the way that we interact with the game, our approach for organization could have different requirements. So let's go through a couple broad categories and try to identify the best way of organizing cards for each one of those individual categories. At the end, I'll walk through my preferred method, and if none of these methods seem right for you, I'd encourage you to find your own. Invent an organizational strategy that works for you. The first broad category that I'd like to discuss is the digital collector. And I'm not saying somebody that plays Magic Online or Magic Arena as their primary platform of choice, but rather somebody who uses digital platforms to build their decks and to track their collections. If you are scanning all of your cards into something like ManaBox, and you build your decks using Moxfield, EDHREC, and Scryfall, it can be really useful to have all of your cards organized in an easily accessible way. A lot of people online recommend this specific strategy, and that is alphabetized by set. This has a handful of pros and cons, so let's walk through the pros first. If you know what you're looking for, you can find it in seconds. Using something like ManaBox that catalogs every single card you own, you know whether or not you have something. And if you know you have it, all you have to do is go to this set and then find it alphabetically. You can organize your entire collection into long boxes like this, with each one being a specific set or a collection of sets, and all of your cards are available at the 2 or 3 seconds of searching. So now let's move on to the cons of alphabetized by set. I think the biggest one is just mental load. The amount of energy that you have to devote to the initial sorting and organization of the cards and the upkeep of those cards over time can be fairly taxing. And if you don't have the time or mental energy to commit to it, it can be difficult to keep up with. And if it gets too far out of sort, it can be a big lift to bring it back in line. Similarly, reflecting your physical collection in a digital database like ManaBox can be tricky. And making sure that that is reflected one-to-one can also be difficult to achieve and difficult to maintain. The last con I'll talk about is more a personal preference. I like deck building in paper. I like building a physical stack of cards and making cuts through repeated gameplay, finding which cards work and which ones don't, and it's a lot easier to do having a stack of cards right there with me where I can shuffle up and run it again. This isn't true of everybody, and it doesn't reflect everybody's personal process for building and brewing decks, but going through a set and looking at cards alphabetically won't necessarily help me find all good blue enchantments. And so that sorting doesn't necessarily work for me. But it could be perfect for you. And if you already have a lot of your cards built into a database, and you already use a lot of digital platforms to develop your deck lists and workshop things online, well, it might just be perfect for you. Our second broad category is the format aficionado, someone who is entirely focused on one particular format or one particular deck within one particular format. And for those types of players, typically there isn't a substantial collection to manage. Anything that falls outside of those played formats is essentially trade fodder, or something to be given away or organized. And for anything that doesn't fall within those formats, I think you can safely just organize it by color, separate out any cards that are worth more than $5 to $10, and throw those into a binder, but otherwise they go into deep freeze. At some point in the future, you might explore other formats, but for now, focus on what you play. It's important that you have the cards that are legal within that format separated and organized. And within those playables, I'd separate them out by archetype. Have some of the combo lines or interactions that look interesting that you have playsets of set aside. One of the really useful things that I've found for this are the little black boxes that used to come in the bundles, where you could just take a few different decks worth of core cards and separate those out. And it might get a little bit more than that. Maybe you have to take the entire bundle box and fill this up, but this is essentially my pre-modern brewing box. It has a bunch of cards that are legal in pre-modern, and anytime I want to build a new deck for those formats, I really only have to go to this box alone, and it doesn't take me more than a couple minutes to pull out most of what I need to get started on a deck. I think the biggest pro of this is that it's fairly simple. If there's only a handful of formats that you play heavily, you can get those organized by bundle box or by long box pretty easily, and anybody can go through a box this size in half an hour and find all of the cards that they're looking for their specific deck. Another pro would be that it doesn't preclude you from using those online tools. You can have your entire collection scanned into a digital format to know what you have and what you don't, and you can use things like Moxfield to build out your decks digitally and see which cards you're missing and which cards you have. Because again, it's easy enough to find the cards that you have because they are sectioned off by format. You only have to go through the standard box to find the cards that are useful for you. And you don't have to keep every card that's legal in standard. It only has to be the good stuff. Secondly, if you are building a new deck, it's really easy to brew in paper or digitally because you have both of those options available. All of the cards are in one location. You know that the legality is good on all of them in that box. From the cons perspective, I think the biggest con is that if you do move away from those formats, it can be a little tricky to build decks outside of that. Going from something like pre-modern to something like CEDH, you're going to run into a couple of issues with which cards you have very easily accessible and which cards are now in a giant disorganized box. If you play Modern heavily and decide you want to build a really competitive legacy deck, well, some of those good legacy cards might be buried a little bit. And I can tell you from experience, digging through 15,000 cards to find that one Mystic Remora that you know is in there somewhere is not a great experience. And that brings us to our last category, that being the paper player. The person who has multiple collections worth of cards purely in paper, that prefers brewing by stacking up cards with similar function or cards that do what you need them to for the deck. This is a lot of older players that play primarily Commander that have decades worth of cards that have been built up with zero organization. I'm of course talking about myself. My collection has grown beyond the scope of my ability to organize it well. So my methodology for organization has been similarly scaled back. I don't have the time to alphabetize and sort the 100,000 or so cards that I own. So the way that I handle my collection is going to be somewhat specific for me. But it's something that I wanted to throw out there because I think it's an approach that I haven't seen anywhere else, and I do think it's somewhat useful. I got the idea from a video that I saw years ago, talking about how to organize your closet, your wardrobe. Placing all of your button-up shirts and other things that hang in the closet with the hangers facing in. And then as you wear them, you flip it so the hanger faces out and you move it to the right. And over time, you start to see which items you wear frequently and which items never get touched. And so that's the approach that I have chosen to take with my Magic collection. I have every card I own, minus the ones that are on the table right now. This is still left over from the chaos of MagicCon, but it will be going back into boxes shortly. Organized by color. And within each of those colors, I have separated out a section of cards that I view as high priority targets and moved those into either bundle boxes or long boxes, separate from the big boxes that I can't quite pick up from here that hold easily 4,000 cards. Those large boxes are where I have each color organized down the line through multiple boxes. And as cards get pulled out, I start building up boxes that look like this. Each one of these cards was a consideration for a Commander deck. There's some really good cards in here. I have some cards in here that are actually banned in Commander, probably left over from building a cube a little while ago. But each of these cards has a use. It has a certain degree of power that made me pull it out of the pile. And so now when I go back through this box and I want to reorganize things, I'm going to take each of these cards and sort them by color. And then in those long box rows where I have those colors, these cards are going at the front. And over time, my cards eventually begin to sift through, with the good cards at the front and the less used cards at the back. Now there's some pros and cons to this marching order of cards through my collection. The pros are, if I'm building a new deck, specifically for Commander, it's really easy to find all the cards that I'd want to use because they're probably at the front. There's a lot of cons here. But the second pro is that I don't have to think about it that hard. This is something that I can easily do in my free time. I've got 2 kids, a full-time job, lots of other responsibilities. This allows me to keep my cards reasonably organized, just to the point where if I want to build a new deck, I can do it quickly and fairly effectively. If I do find the time to dig through the rest of the cards, I am willing to go deeper into this. The further back I go in each one of these colors, the more esoteric and unique and specific the cards become. To the point where when I get to the very back, well, there's a lot of cards from Scourge and Legion that just are unplayably bad. On the cons side, I think we find ourselves in a position where if we do want to build a deck digitally, it can be kind of tricky to find the cards to populate out that list. I have a pretty good feel for where my cards exist within my collection, and I can still find them fairly quickly. A good gauge of where in these boxes the card that I'm looking for falls, on a scale from never used to just popped out of another deck. But even with that, I do find myself occasionally buying singles that I know I have playsets of, just because I couldn't find the playset in my cards. And in some respects, that is the mark of a bad organization system, but in the reality, my time is something I value. And an organization system that captures that aspect, that mental load, that availability of searching, I think is really important to me as well. Finally, on the cons, I will throw out that I don't really play in formats. I play casually for the most part. I play Commander for the most part. So there's not a lot of ban list, restricted lists, and limited card pools that I ever interact with. I've just started to dip my toe into Canadian Highlander, and that similarly has very few restrictions on which cards I can use, and so I anticipate I also won't run into a problem there. However, in my last video I mentioned that thanks to Magic Foundations, I'm looking to get into Standard, and I'm looking to build an elf deck, and I know I have Blooming Marsh. I know I have several Blooming Marshes, but I don't know where they are. So I have a long search ahead of me to dig through a whole lot of non-basic lands to track those down. But even with that, this is worth it to me. This organizational strategy of finding the cards that are useful at the front of the line where I can access them easily, and anytime I need to swap cards out, it's really easy to find alternatives. As I make cuts, they go back in the box. As somebody with a large collection and a lot of decks that are always in progress, I like having that. I don't think there's any perfect way of sorting your Magic cards, because there are too many different ways of playing the game and interacting with cards that I don't think you could prescribe a single one that fits everybody. But I hope this has given you a few different ideas of ways to try to get this mess in order. Because obviously I'm still a work in progress. And if you have really cool methods that you use, I'd love to hear about them, because I love borrowing ideas from other people and finding ways to integrate that into my own collection. It's been really nice talking to you.